I was reaching for my cup of coffee when the old waiter leaned closer, his hand trembling just slightly, and whispered words that froze me in place. His voice was low, urgent, almost fearful, yet what he said about my daughter and her husband was so impossible, so unthinkable that my heart stopped for a beat. I stared at him, the chatter of the cafe blurring into silence around me. Could it be true, or had age and suspicion played tricks on his mind? I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. If you were in my shoes, if a stranger told you something terrifying about your family, would you believe it? I want you to share your thoughts in the comments below. And please tell me where you're watching this from. It always amazes me how many of you join me from different corners of the world. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss what comes after, because the truth I discovered is heavier than you can imagine. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 68 years old, a retired school librarian, and I live alone in a small apartment by the sea. Since my husband passed away nearly a decade ago, the sound of the waves has been both my comfort and my reminder that life moves on whether you are ready or not. I never thought I would find myself at the center of a story like this. I have always believed in keeping peace, in minding my own business, in trusting my daughter to make her own choices. But what happened that morning in the cafe tore open a door I had tried to keep closed. The man who spoke to me, Henry, had worked in that coffee shop for as long as I could remember. He had served me countless cups without more than a polite smile. That day, however, his eyes were different, sharp, worried, and almost pleading. "Mrs. Collins," he said softly, "keep an eye on your daughter, and that husband of hers. They are not who you think." Then, as if afraid someone might overhear, he straightened up, cleared his throat, and walked away, leaving me with a bitter taste that had nothing to do with coffee. I told myself it was nonsense. Victor, my son-in-law, was many things. Quiet, perhaps overly polite, often speaking about the struggles of his family, but he had always treated me respectfully. Emily, my only daughter, was his wife, my flesh and blood. Why would Henry say such a thing? And yet, as I sat there, the cup cooling in my hands, I felt the first ripple of unease. Henry had nothing to gain from scaring me. His whisper wasn't malicious gossip. It was a warning. My mind wanted to dismiss it, but my body knew better. My palms were damp, my throat dry, and an old ache stirred in my chest, the ache of a mother sensing danger, but not yet ready to name it. I left the cafe walking along the boardwalk where the gulls cried overhead. The morning sun glinted off the ocean, mocking the storm inside me. The waves were steady, timeless, but my thoughts churned like a tide about to drag me under. I tried to shake it off, to laugh at myself for even considering Henry's words. And yet they echoed louder with every step. They are not who you think. That was the moment the silence of my life cracked. I did not know it then, but I had already stepped into a story that would test every ounce of trust I had left. I tried to push Henry's words aside, but once a seed of doubt is planted, it takes root in the smallest cracks of your mind. A week passed, then another, and life seemed ordinary enough until the moment I saw something that made my breath hitch. Emily and her husband, Victor, had come to Sunday dinner as they often did. Victor, as usual, spoke with that weary sigh he carried like a badge of honor. He complained about the rent, about medical bills for his father, about how hard it was to make ends meet. I listened, nodding, reminding myself that families struggle and perhaps Henry had been mistaken. But the very next morning, on my way to the post office, I saw him. Victor stepped out of a gleaming storefront I had only admired from a distance, a luxury watch shop where a single item in the window could cost more than my yearly pension. He was not looking weary then. His stride was brisk, his expression almost triumphant. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, and though I tried to convince myself it was imagination, I swore I saw the glint of a new watch on his wrist. I froze across the street, clutching my letters as though they might anchor me to reality. Perhaps he was simply window shopping, I told myself. Perhaps he had been repairing an old piece. But the polished bag in his hand said otherwise. I walked home with a heaviness pressing down on my chest, Henry's warning now echoing louder, refusing to be ignored. That evening, as I watered the small geraniums on my balcony, I met my new neighbor for the first time. Helen, a nurse in her early 50s, had just moved into the unit across the hall. She had kind eyes, the sort of eyes that had seen too much pain, but still managed to hold compassion. She leaned against the railing, watching the sunset. We exchanged pleasantries, and soon enough the conversation drifted, as it often does, toward family. When I mentioned my daughter Emily, Helen's expression changed almost imperceptibly. She hesitated as though debating whether to speak. Finally, she lowered her voice. "I don't mean to intrude, Mrs. Collins, but I think I've seen your son-in-law before. Was he wearing a gray suit last Thursday evening?" My heart skipped. "Yes, that sounds like him." Helen nodded slowly. I was covering a shift at the hospital, and on my way home, I passed the Grand Harbor Hotel. There was a banquet that night. I'm almost sure I saw him there, laughing with a group of people, all of them dressed in tuxedos and evening gowns. They didn't look like people struggling to pay bills. Her words fell into the silence between us, heavy as stones. I thanked her politely, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped the watering can. Another piece of the puzzle. Another inconsistency. Back in my apartment, I sat in the dim light of my living room staring at the framed photograph of Emily and Victor on their wedding day. How could the same man who once promised to cherish my daughter now slip so easily into a life of deceit? Was I imagining all of this, or had Henry's whisper simply opened my eyes to what was already there? The waves outside roared faintly through the open window, steady and eternal, while inside me everything grew unsteady. I told myself to stay calm, to collect facts, not accusations. Yet a truth was forming quietly in the corners of my mind, as undeniable as the tide. Something was very wrong with Victor, and I could no longer pretend not to see it. Helen's words lingered with me long after she had gone back inside. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Victor stepping out of that watch shop, or laughing under the golden chandeliers of the Grand Harbor Hotel. By morning, the unease had settled into my bones. I wanted desperately to believe I was wrong, that all of this was nothing more than coincidence. But life has a cruel way of stacking evidence when you're not ready to face it. It began with a phone call from Emily. Her voice was tight, almost rehearsed. "Mom, could you help us out this month? Dad's medical bills have gotten worse. The hospital won't wait, and Victor is already working double shifts." I pressed the phone to my ear, staring at the bills scattered on my own kitchen table. She spoke with such urgency, such conviction, that a part of me felt guilty for even hesitating. Gerald, Victor's father, was a man I barely knew, always described as frail, coughing in bed, unable to manage his health expenses. I sighed, reached for my worn checkbook, and wrote another number I could hardly afford. What kind of mother turns her back on her daughter's plea? But 2 days later, as if fate wanted to mock me, I heard a different story. I had taken a cab to the grocery store because the rain was falling hard that afternoon. The driver, a man named Tommy, was chatty, the kind who filled silence with anecdotes. Somewhere between the traffic lights and the rattle of the windshield wipers, he mentioned the casino out by the marina. Busy weekend, he chuckled. Had an older gentleman in the back seat, swore he'd cracked some kind of lucky streak. Dropped nearly $1,000 at the tables easy. Said his name was Gerald, regular there, I guess. I stiffened. "Gerald?" I repeated carefully. "Yeah." Tommy nodded, eyes still on the road. "Dressed nice, too. Expensive shoes, good cologne. Not what you'd expect from someone down on his luck." My fingers clenched around my purse. I wanted to tell him he must be mistaken, that there are many Geralds in this town. But the name, the description, even the way Tommy said he carried himself, it all fit too well. When I returned home, I set the grocery bags on the counter and just stood there staring at nothing. Emily had begged me for money to pay for her father-in-law's treatment, and yet only days earlier that same man had walked proudly through a casino, throwing away more than I spent in a month. The contradictions piled up like storm clouds. Victor's weary tone, the urgent requests, Emily's trembling voice, all painted a picture of desperation. But the watch bag, the hotel banquet, the casino tales painted a life of indulgence and lies, which was the truth. The geraniums on my balcony swayed in the wind as I leaned against the railing, my chest tight. I thought of Henry's whisper, Helen's confession, Tommy's casual remark. None of them knew each other yet, all their fragments fit together too neatly. It was as though the universe itself was conspiring to peel away the veil I had so carefully kept over my eyes. And for the first time, I admitted to myself this was no longer coincidence. This was a pattern, a performance, a deception played out in front of me while I had been too blind or too trusting to see it. The contradictions haunted me. They followed me into the kitchen when I counted coins into the pharmacy, when I stood in front of the shelf debating which prescription I could go without this month. My pension was modest, just enough to keep the lights on food in the pantry and medicine in my cabinet. Yet each time Emily's voice trembled on the phone asking for help with urgent bills, I reached deeper into pockets already turned inside out. I cut half my heart medication 1 week, stretched it longer than my doctor advised. I told myself it was fine, my body was strong enough, surely. I skipped the jar of peanut butter. I liked the small indulgence of a crossword magazine at the corner store. I told myself every sacrifice was worth it if it meant Emily didn't have to suffer the shame of unpaid medical bills. That's what mothers do. We bleed quietly so our children don't have to. But the bleeding grew heavier when a different voice reached me, my son Jacob. My youngest, the one who had always been more guarded than his sister. He lived 2 states away, working long hours in construction, a life rougher than I ever wanted for him, yet honest. One evening, the phone rang, his voice low but urgent. "Mom," he said, "I don't want to upset you, but you need to be careful about Victor." My stomach turned cold. "What do you mean I follow him on social media?" Jacob continued. "Most of what he posts is locked down, but last week a picture slipped through. He was at the Harborview Golf Club wearing a polo and grinning with a group of guys. That's not a public park, Mom. That place costs thousands just for membership." I sank into my armchair, clutching the phone tighter. The geraniums outside had wilted slightly, their petals sagging as though mirroring my heart. Jacob hesitated, then added, "I'm not saying anything to Emily yet, but you can't keep sending money without asking questions. Something isn't right." I wanted to thank him, to admit that his words confirmed the storm already raging in me. But instead, I whispered, "Please, Jacob, don't mention this to your sister. She's fragile and she loves him. If she thinks we're attacking her husband, she'll only push us away." The silence on the other end stretched thick and heavy. "Mom," Jacob said, "finally, love shouldn't blind us to the truth." Then the line went quiet. I sat there long after the call ended, staring at the framed family photo on my mantel. Emily's smile on her wedding day was so bright, so trusting. I remembered the way she had squeezed my hand, whispering, "He'll take care of me, Mom." And I believed her. Now the irony cut deep. I was the one taking care of them, sacrificing medicine meals and peace of mind. And still, part of me clung to silence. Because if I spoke, if I laid bare what I had seen and heard, Emily might not only reject my words, she might reject me. And the thought of losing my daughter's trust was a wound far greater than any bill or prescription I could forfeit. Jacob's warning replayed in my mind for days, like a song I couldn't turn off. I moved through my routines, watering the flowers, sorting the mail, heating soup on the stove. But beneath every ordinary act was a current of unease. It was as if life itself had split in two, the daughter I loved, the family she trusted, and then the darker version, the one Henry, Helen, Tommy, and now Jacob had shown me piece by piece. Then one morning, as I was folding laundry at the kitchen table, my phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number. My first thought was scam, but when I opened it, I froze. A photo of a receipt, crisp and clear, the ink so sharp it felt like it might bleed right through my screen. A purchase of imported wine, nearly $800 in total. Bottles I recognized from the locked glass cases at the upscale liquor store near the marina. And there at the bottom, bold and undeniable, Victor Collins. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep the sound from escaping. Along with the photo came a short text, and says, "Collins, I thought you should see this. Please don't ask how I got it, but I know the truth matters. No name, no explanation. Yet I didn't need one." In my heart, I knew it came from Henry, the old waiter whose whisper had started this unraveling. I printed the receipt, slid it into a folder I kept hidden in the drawer under my bills. That was the moment I began keeping records as if I were building a case in court. Not just whispers, not just feelings proof. And soon, more pieces came. Helen knocked on my door one evening carrying a plate of banana bread wrapped in foil. We sat at my kitchen table, steam rising from our mugs of tea. Her voice was low, cautious, but steady. "I saw Emily downtown last week," she said gently. "She had a handbag, a very expensive one. I asked about it, trying to make conversation, and she smiled and said it was borrowed from a friend." Helen shook her head. "It didn't look borrowed. It looked brand new." I smiled politely, thanked her, even managed a small laugh. But inside, something tightened like a knot being pulled. Emily, my own daughter, brushing away questions with a casual lie. Or perhaps she believed it herself. Denial can wear many masks. That night, I opened my notebook, the kind I used to keep for library inventory, and began to write. Dates, times, details, the watch shop, the banquet, the casino, the golf club, the wine receipt, the handbag. Each entry a stone laid on the path toward a truth I could no longer ignore. I looked at the page when I was finished, the ink still glistening under the lamp. It didn't read like gossip. It read like evidence, like a story assembling itself, one that would demand to be told whether I was ready or not. And as I closed the notebook, I realized the silence I had been keeping was no longer safety. It was complicity. The folder in my drawer grew heavier each day, though it held only paper. Proof has a weight of its own, and I carried it around like a stone in my chest. Still, I told myself I needed more, something undeniable, something even Emily couldn't explain away. That conviction led me to a decision I never thought I'd make. At my age, I began to follow Victor. It was a Thursday afternoon, the sky bruised with storm clouds. I told Emily I was too tired to join them for dinner, then walked the few blocks to where Victor usually parked near his office downtown. My heart hammered as I stood half-hidden behind a lamppost, ridiculous as it sounds. A 68-year-old widow skulking like a detective in her own daughter's life. Yet there I was, clutching my coat tight against the wind, waiting. When Victor finally appeared, he was not the weary man I'd seen at my table so many Sundays. His shoulders were straight, his pace confident, his suit freshly pressed, and in his hand dangled keys that chirped as he approached a car I had never seen before, a sleek silver sedan, spotless, gleaming, the kind of car that doesn't belong to men begging for rent money. I nearly stepped forward, then nearly called his name, but the passenger door opened first. A woman slid out her laughter light, her hand brushing his arm as though it belonged there. She was striking tall, elegant, with dark hair that caught the last of the daylight. Victor leaned close, too close, their conversation lost to the hum of traffic, but their body language said everything words could not. They drove away together, and my feet moved before my mind could stop them. I hailed a cab, asked the driver to keep a distance. My palms sweated against the leather seat as I watched that silver car weave through the streets, finally stopping outside a restaurant I knew well, expensive, candlelit, the kind reserved for anniversaries and business deals. I lingered on the opposite sidewalk, my breath fogging the air. Through the wide windows, I saw them seated together, wine glasses between them, their heads bent close. When the waiter arrived, Victor rested his hand on hers for just a moment, casual, intimate, unthinking. It was not the gesture of a man with a business partner. It was the gesture of a man with a secret. Later, I learned her name, Claudia, introduced in passing casually as a colleague helping with some consulting work. But I had seen the truth written in the way she leaned into him, the way he smiled back. No business deal I'd ever witnessed had looked like that. I returned home that night with the kind of silence that cuts deeper than shouting. My notebook lay open on the table, waiting. I added a new line, Victor Silver Sedan, Claudia Restaurant, Intimate Gestures. The ink trembled slightly under my hand. I could have called Emily. I could have told her everything in a rush of outrage and pain. But I didn't, because what I had seen, as devastating as it was, would destroy her if I spoke too soon. So I swallowed my fury, folded it into silence, and promised myself this: I would gather every shred of truth before the day I placed it in front of her. I thought silence would protect Emily, that by gathering proof quietly, I could shield her until the right moment. But silence, I learned, is like water behind a dam. It swells, it pushes, and eventually it breaks. The break came sooner than I expected on a gray Saturday morning when Jacob appeared at my door, his suitcase still dusty from the road. "Mom," he said, pulling me into a hug, "we can't wait anymore. Emily needs to know." I wanted to argue to tell him the timing wasn't right, but the determination in his eyes was a mirror of my own fears. He had grown into the kind of man who carried truth like a weapon, blunt but necessary. Together, we sat at my kitchen table, the folder of evidence spread open between us. Receipts, notes, photos, all the fragments I had been collecting like a secret burden. When Emily arrived that afternoon, she walked in, humming, her hair pulled back, her face soft, with the kind of peace that comes from not knowing. My hands shook as I poured her tea, the steam rising like smoke from something burning. Jacob wasted no time. "Em," he said firmly, "you need to hear what Mom has found." At first, she laughed, a small, nervous laugh, the kind she used as a shield. But when I slid the receipt across the table, the one with Victor's name printed beneath bottles of wine worth more than my month's pension, her laughter cracked. "This doesn't prove anything," she snapped. Maybe it was a gift. Maybe next came the notes in my hand, the testimony from Helen, from Tommy, the quiet whispers I had recorded as carefully as if they were sacred texts. Emily's face flushed with anger. "Mom, you've been listening to gossip. You don't understand Victor. You never liked him." Her words cut deeper than she knew. I almost folded, almost apologized for meddling, but Jacob leaned forward, his voice steady. "Emily, it's not just gossip." He unlocked his phone and slid it across the table. On the screen, a photograph bloomed Victor on the beach, his arm around Claudia, their bodies pressed together in the golden light of sunset. Not colleagues, not friends, lovers. Emily's hand flew to her mouth, the teacup rattling against the saucer as tears blurred her eyes. "No," she whispered, but her voice had already lost its fight. The silence that followed was thick, unbearable, until Victor himself walked through the door, casual, as if he were returning from errands. He froze at the sight of Jacob, at the papers spread across the table. And then Emily's trembling voice, "Victor, tell me the truth." For a long moment, he tried to mask it, weaving half-stories, excuses, fragments of lies. But the weight of evidence left no room to hide. Finally, with a shrug that chilled me, he admitted it. The financial troubles had been fabricated, a story to siphon money from my daughter and me. And yes, Claudia was more than a business partner. Emily's sobs filled the room, and I sat there with my heart breaking not just for her marriage, but for the innocence she lost in that instant. Victor's confession did not echo, it shattered. The words hung in the air like broken glass, sharp, impossible to step around. Emily sat crumpled on the couch, her face buried in her hands, while Jacob stood rigid near the window, jaw clenched as if holding back a storm. I meanwhile sat very still. Years of widowhood had taught me that silence sometimes steadies a room when nothing else can. The days that followed blurred into one long ache. Emily filed for divorce, her hands trembling as she signed each document. She moved back into my small house by the coast boxes of her life stacked along my hallway. She slept fitfully, woke with tears, and yet I saw strength flicker beneath her grief like coals refusing to die out. Victor left town swiftly, his silver car a streak, vanishing into the horizon. His family, once so present with their endless pleas for help, melted into the shadows as well. No farewell, no explanation, only absence. For all their noise and need, they disappeared quietly like thieves slipping out a back door. One evening, weeks after the storm had broken, Jacob and I sat in the kitchen sorting through Emily's unopened boxes. He paused, holding an old photograph of us by the pier, then looked at me with an expression that was both tender and fierce. "Mom," he said, "you saved her. Even if she doesn't see it yet, you did." But I shook my head. "No, Jacob. We saved her. You came back when I needed courage. I was afraid to break her heart with the truth. You reminded me that truth, no matter how brutal, is a form of love." It was the next morning while I stood in line at the cafe that I saw Henry again, the same old waiter who had whispered the first warning. His hand trembled slightly as he poured my coffee, and then quietly he leaned toward me. "I suppose you know everything now," he said. I nodded. His eyes, tired and kind, held mine for a long moment before he spoke again. "I never told you why I warned you. Years ago, my sister married a man like Victor. Smooth words, endless lies, hands always reaching for more. She gave him everything until there was nothing left, not her savings, not her health, not even her will to live. I couldn't watch another woman fall into that trap, not when I saw your face that day counting coins for a cake." His voice cracked, and I placed my hand over his. "You gave me the courage I needed, Henry, more than you know." That night, Emily, Jacob, and I sat at my small wooden table, dinner steaming between us. No fancy wine, no hidden debts, just roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and the kind of silence that felt whole instead of broken. Emily's smile was faint but real, and Jacob's laughter filled the room like music. I realized then the truth I wanted etched into our lives: love that protects is love that lasts. And no one at that table would ever mistake exploitation for affection again.